Hey everybody, Charles from GMAT Ninja here. Today we're going to talk about the short passages on the GRE verbal section. So just one paragraph, one question. Usually it's a short paragraph, about 3 sentences to it. Going to give you a nice, clean, repeatable technique for tackling really all 4 types that you're going to see of those short questions. Before we get into that, I want to talk big picture for just a moment. I want to make sure you use your study time wisely and understand how important or not important these are on the GRE verbal section. If you're new to the GRE, first verbal section, 12 questions. Second verbal section, 15 questions, total of 27. About half of those questions are going to be vocab-based. About half are going to be reading comprehension. Now, your reading comprehension is going to be either longer passages, 3 questions each, mid-length passages with 2 questions each, or these short guys that we're concerned with today with 1 question. Here's the thing that's kind of annoying. I would love to say to you, hey, you're going to see exactly this many of these short passages. That's not the case. As we look at the practice test, the actual exam, we're seeing some variety on the GRE. Looks like you're going to see 1 to 3 questions out of your 27 that are going to be these short guys. So a couple thoughts there. If you're looking for a huge score improvement, if you need a really elite verbal score for the programs you're applying to, certainly is going to be worth your while to get really good at these as well, even though they're a relatively small proportion of your overall verbal score. If you're looking for a modest score, modest bump, maybe this isn't worth your time. Now, all that said, I would argue that of these different question types on GRE verbal, these are probably the ones that are the most straightforward to improve. We've been tutoring GRE at GMAT Ninja for more than 20 years now. This is probably the question type that if somebody struggles on it, it's usually the quickest turnaround for them to be clear. There's a very specific way that you want to read these depending on the exact question type. And if you can master that, you're going to be in really, really good shape. So that's what we're going to focus on today. I'm going to take you through the 4 main question types that you see on these short passages. Strengthen and weaken questions, and we're going to focus specifically on a weakened one, but the process is very much the same for a question that asks you to strengthen the author's argument. Second, we're going to dive into an assumption question, very, very similar to the strengthen and weaken as far as your overall process, but a little bit different logic. Third, we're going to do a discrepancy or paradox kind of question. And fourth, we're going to finish up with an inference question, which doesn't sound all that interesting, but we see students make plenty of mistakes on those, even when they understand the passage just fine. Want to make sure that you have a good, clean process and that you nail those if you understand the passage well enough. So that's it. Those are going to be your 4 main types of these short questions. So fairly straightforward, which is why if you could use a little bump on your GRE verbal score, even though these aren't super common, you might want to stick with us. All right. As always, these videos are part of our full complete GRE course. We love offering it up for free here on YouTube. If you're really enjoying these videos, hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, helps other people find them. If this is saving you from buying a course somewhere, please consider donating to one of our charities. As part of why we do this is we love offering something for free. We also love supporting some of our favorite charities. So come hit us up at gmatninja.com/donate. And we also offer one-on-one private tutoring. So if you could use some one-on-one attention, really target your weaknesses, feel free to reach out, gmatninja.com. All right, with that, we're going to hop into our first passage. Go ahead and take a look at this, and then we'll kind of break down how best to approach it after you take a couple minutes looking at it. All right, if you need a little more time, feel free to hit that pause button. Okay, the key to doing really, really well on these kind of questions on the GRE, make sure that you're thinking structurally. In this particular case, what do I mean by this kind of question? I mean these short questions, just 1 paragraph, 2 or 3 sentences. And question type number 1, strengthen, weaken questions. This one's weaken. Nothing super complicated going on logically, but if you're going to weaken the passage or strengthen the argument, job number 1, make sure you're crystal clear about what exactly is the author's conclusion here. And then make sure you're crystal clear about how the author arrived at that. What's their support for that conclusion? So here's what I want you to do every time, and I'm agnostic about whether you write this down or not. Some people really benefit from having this on your page. Some of you, you're fine just doing this in your heads. So looking at this particular passage, what's our conclusion? They're nothing super hard here. They're not trying to hide it from you. In this case, it happens to be the last sentence set off by that therefore. If farmers were to remove those trees, there would be more water would be available for crop irrigation. All right. Now, one small thing I want you to do every single time, super critical on these short questions. As soon as you say, okay, I found the author's conclusion here. If farmers were to remove those trees that are along the riverbank, more water would be available for crop irrigation. I want you to ask yourself, is this their words or my words? It's really easy to paraphrase this into oblivion, turn that conclusion into something a little bit different. One of the things, a little bit of a silly textbook example, but imagine that there was a conclusion to a passage like this that says, X is a solution to our problem, versus X is a good solution to our problem, versus X is the best solution to our problem, versus X is the only solution to our problem. We tweak one little word and it might totally change what you need to do to weaken that passage. So I want you to be really, really careful. I would not say the same thing about longer form reading comprehension necessarily, where paraphrasing is good. If you saw our video on long passages, of course, we're doing all kinds of paraphrasing, and that can be okay as long as you're not completely twisting the author's words. Here on these short guys, if you change that conclusion just a little bit, you're playing with fire, you might make errors. So step 1, when you see a strengthen or weaken question on the GRE, ask yourself, what exactly is the conclusion in the author's words? Is this their words or mine? Verify that before you move on. Okay, step 2, just make sure you're really clear about how the author got there. In this particular case, I'm going to argue that first sentence is really just kind of setting the stage. Okay, in the arid land along the Colorado River, here in my backyard, here in beautiful Colorado, use of the river's water strictly controlled, and farms have a limited allocation of water they can use for irrigation. Okay, great. That doesn't really support this. That's just kind of your background information. Cool. But it's that next sentence here that logically really supports this. The trees that grow in narrow strips along the river's banks also use its water. So trees that grow, I want to be careful about the language, in narrow strips along the river's banks. Also use its water. So pretty typical of the GRE. Nice straightforward argument. Hey, there's trees in narrow strips along the river's banks. The trees use that same water. So if we cut those trees down, if farmers were to remove those trees, then there's more total water available for irrigation. And our goal here is to go ahead and weaken this argument. Okay, so again, structure-wise, nothing super fancy here. If you pick up a book, especially for the GMAT or LSAT that have identical question types to this, have strength and weaken questions, you'll see all kinds of crazy stuff. Let's find premises and counter premises and catheter truncheon winches, and there's all this labeling and terminology. You're taking the GRE. Don't worry about that crap. Don't waste your time on it. Very, very simple thing. You see a strengthen or weaken question. Ask yourself, what's the author's conclusion? Their words or mine? How did the author get there? Do I understand that intuitively, how the support connects to the conclusion? Ask yourself, their words or mine. Make sure you're getting their words, not paraphrasing it too much. That's it. Clear about how this fits together. Makes total sense here. And we're in good shape, and we can move on to the answer choices. Now, as always, if you watch any of our other verbal videos, you've heard me say this. Don't fall in love with an answer choice. You always want to find 4 wrong answers on these questions, not 1 right answer. Because it's really, really easy to find an answer choice that looks right, but is really wrong, sounds good, sounds relevant. Make sure you're taking the time. Treat all 5 answer choices equally. All right. Answer choice A. Owners of farms along the river will probably not undertake the expense of cutting down trees along the riverbanks unless they are granted a greater allocation of water in return. Okay, again, notice what's the conclusion here? We've got this little conditional statement there. If farmers were to remove those trees, more water would be available for crop irrigation. A doesn't weaken it at all because it's saying, well, maybe they wouldn't bother removing those trees. Well, that doesn't matter. The conclusion says if they were to remove these trees, this would be the consequence. So for that reason, we can get rid of A, because whether or not they actually do it is irrelevant to that conclusion, exactly as the author's written it. All right, what about B? The trees along the river's banks shelter it from sun and wind, thereby greatly reducing the amount of water loss or evaporation. Okay, let's think through that. If we get rid of the trees, more water will be lost through evaporation. That means there's less total water flowing through the river. And you bet that would weaken this conclusion, because if we're losing more water evaporation, then there's actually less water available for crop irrigation. So B sounds fantastic so far. But again, as always, I'm going to say I like B. I don't circle it. I don't put a smiley face. I just say I'm going to underline it. I'm going to keep it. I would do exactly the same thing if I didn't understand B. I would do the same thing, just underline it and say I'm going to come back to it on the next pass through. So keeping it in, washing our brains, moving on to answer choice C. Many of the tree species currently found along the river's banks are specifically adapted to growing in places where the tree roots remain constantly wet. Fantastic. That makes total sense that those trees would do that. But why would that weaken this conclusion? Has absolutely nothing to do with it. Really, sort of whether those trees are adapted to growing right along riverbanks where their roots are wet has nothing to do with whether removing them would allow us more water for irrigation. So we can get rid of C. What about D? The strip of land where trees grow along the river's banks would not be suitable for growing crops if the trees are removed. That kind of feels relevant, right? Oh, we cut those down, but we wouldn't have more cropland, so maybe it's not great for farmers to do that. Feels relevant on some level to the question of should farmers do that, but it is irrelevant to this question of would there be more water available. So whether or not farmers can plant trees or something else there has really nothing to do with whether or not there would be more water available for those crops. The future use of that land is irrelevant here. We're just asking what happens to the available water if we cut down those trees. So D is not relevant. We can get rid of that. And what about E? Distribution of water allocations for irrigation is intended to prevent farms farther upstream from using water needed by farms farther downstream. Another one that's pretty irrelevant here, because the question isn't how do we redesign the allocation. The question is about the total amount of water available for crop irrigation. How exactly those water rights are distributed among different farms, upstream, downstream, has nothing to do with the total amount that's available for irrigation, and certainly nothing to do with what would happen if we decided to cut down a bunch of those trees along the riverbanks. So E is out, and B is our winner here. Okay. In case you're wondering, fairly, I'd say, medium difficulty question, but also pretty typical of the kind of thing you're going to see on the GRE. They generally aren't going to melt your face off with these questions and make them super hard. So most of the questions I'm going to do in the rest of this video, moderate difficulty. I'll challenge you a little bit on the fourth one. Okay. Next one, very, very similar thing. It's going to be an assumption question. Same general idea applies. Same fundamental process, find that conclusion, find that support. Whenever you see a question that's strengthen, weaken, or assumption, there's always going to be a conclusion somewhere in that paragraph. So with that in mind, go ahead and try this next one. And I'd like you to think in terms of that structure, start by finding that conclusion, find that support, and then we'll dive back in together. All right, as always, if you need a little more time, feel free to hit that pause button. Okay, so same exact thing on assumption questions to strengthen and weaken. Job number one, make sure you're thinking structurally about the passage. Ask yourself, what's the author's conclusion? Let me make sure I get it in their words, not in my words. And how did the author arrive there? What's the support? That first part's the same. Once we get to the question itself, some stuff gets a little bit tougher. But processing the passage itself, thinking through that, same thing, strengthen, weaken, or assumption. You're going to do the same process. Make sure you do it nice and systematically every time. Nobody enjoys watching me write stuff on the screen, so starting with it here. Conclusion, nice and straightforward here, where it's just that last sentence, nothing fancy. It's not always going to be the last sentence. Here it is, set off by a nice, clear therefore. Innovation in bicycle technology is limited by what authorities will accept as standard for the purposes of competition in bicycle races. Always ask yourself, is this their words or mine? Here I've got it exactly in their words. And again, I'm totally agnostic about whether you write this down or just have it happening in your head. What I do care about is make sure that it's totally systematic, nice and precise. You take that conclusion for a walk, tweak a couple words. Very, very easy to cause yourself trouble down the line. Harder to eliminate answer choices if you've got a conclusion that's a little bit different from the author. So just be disciplined about this. Whether you're writing it, whether you're not writing it, just make sure it's nice and precise. How'd they get there? We can argue that that first sentence is possibly just setting the stage. In any case, I think the heart of it here is the second sentence. The only cyclists seriously interested in innovation and willing to pay for it are bicycle racers. Therefore, the innovation is limited by what authorities will accept for bike races, because bike racers are really the entire market, according to this argument, for innovation in bicycles. Okay. With that in mind, let's talk about what an assumption is. This is probably the question type on the GRE, at least GRE reading comp, that gives students the most trouble. Which of the following is an assumption made in drawing the conclusion above? Here's how I want you to think about it. An assumption is something that if you add it to this support here, it's going to be something that's going to strengthen your conclusion a little bit, or something that's going to pave a little pothole, reinforce something. So it's going to be something, number one, that strengthens, reinforces, allows this to be drawn. So it might not be a super strong strengthener, but it's going to make this a little bit more reinforced, maybe quite a bit stronger, but it's going to reinforce this a little bit. Number one. Number two, it's going to be something that's necessary. And that's the toughest part. So the assumption is something you're looking for. Criteria one, does it strengthen the conclusion or reinforce it in some way? Criteria number two, do I need it? Does the argument fall apart without it? Okay, with that in mind, let's go ahead and tackle the answer choices. All right, answer choice A, the market for cheap traditional bicycles cannot expand unless the market for high-performance competition bicycles expands. Let's ask ourselves, does that strengthen or support the conclusion in some way? Here I'm going to argue not at all. Look at what's at stake here in A. What are they talking about? The market for cheap traditional bicycles. That has absolutely nothing to do with this. The conclusion is that the innovation is limited by standards of bicycle racing. Whether or not cheap traditional bicycle markets are expanding has absolutely nothing to do with any of that. We're not talking about market expansion, just whether innovation is limited by what happens in bike racing. So doesn't strengthen, doesn't reinforce, we can get rid of A. What about B? High performance bicycles are likely to be improved more as a result of technological innovations developed in small workshops than innovations in major manufacturing concerns. Once again, ask yourself, does it strengthen, reinforce in some way? Not at all. Regardless of where it happens, is where those innovations happen, small workshops, big factories, doesn't have anything to do with what limits that innovation. Conclusions about innovation is limited by the standards of bike racing. Once we add in B, does nothing at all to it, really, because where that innovation happens, small workshops, large manufacturing concerns, totally irrelevant to the question of what limits that innovation. For that reason, we can get rid of B. What about C? Bicycle racers do not generate a strong demand for innovations that fall outside what is officially recognized as standard for the purposes of competition. Okay, now this one starts to strengthen or reinforce a little bit, right? Because if we're saying innovation's limited by what authorities will accept for bike racing, bike racers are the only people that are interested in innovation, there's our support. Now, what if we say that the bike racers don't generate strong demand for innovations that fall outside of that? That definitely reinforces this a little bit, right? Because we're cutting off the possibility that bike racers will buy stuff anyway, even if they can't use it for competition. So C is going to reinforce a little bit. Now, the next question is it something that we need? And I would argue here very much so, because if this isn't true, so what if bike racers do generate strong demand for things that aren't used in competition? This falls apart, right? So now the innovation isn't limited by this at all, because the bike racers will buy stuff anyway, even if they can't use it for competition. So we need C in order to draw that conclusion. It's absolutely necessary, because we have to assume that those bike racers aren't buying stuff, aren't buying these innovative products, aren't generating demand for innovative products that aren't used for competition. So we can hang on to C. What about D? The technology conservatism of bike manufacturers results primarily from their desire to manufacture a product that can be sold without being altered to suit different national markets. A couple ways to think about this. One is, why are we talking about different national markets? That has very, very little to do with this. Another way to think about it is, what does this do to the conclusion? If you add that into the support, what happens? Well, it's basically saying the technological conservatism results from something else. It doesn't result from what works in competition with bike racers. The technological conservatism results from something totally different, which is the lack of need to alter things to suit different national markets. If anything, it might weaken that conclusion a little bit, because it's providing a completely different explanation for this technological conservatism. At best, D is irrelevant. At worst, you could argue it weakens that conclusion a little bit, because it provides a different reason for the lack of innovation. Either way, certainly not something that's going to strengthen or reinforce, and certainly not something we need, so we can get rid of D. And what about E? Authorities who set standards for high-performance bicycle racing do not keep informed about innovative bicycle design. Again, classic, nice, irrelevant thing. Whether or not they know about it has nothing to do with this conclusion, which is that the innovation is limited by what the authorities will accept. Whether or not authorities know about innovative bicycle design or they don't has nothing to do with the fact that, or with the conclusion that they control what's accepted as innovation in bike racing, and therefore limit the innovation overall in bicycles. So for that reason, we can get rid of E, and C is our winner. Okay, again, these assumption questions are a little bit tougher for most people. If you're struggling with them and you want more reps, there's not a ton in the GRE official guides. Feel free to go pick up an official guide from the GMAT, possibly the LSAT if you want some really tough ones. And if you want extra reps just on assumptions specifically, feel free to go through and just cherry pick. Just make sure you're using official GMAT questions, official LSAT questions, plenty of assumption questions available in those resources if you need a little bit of extra practice. Okay, with that, question type number 3, we're going to talk about paradox and discrepancy type questions, and I'll give you a couple of minutes on this next one. And as always, hit that pause button if you need it. Okay. When we talk about pretty much everything on these short questions on the GRE, the big key, again, I'm going to say it over and over, is make sure that you're thinking structurally. Invest in the beginning. Spend some extra time on the passage if you need it to be totally clear about what you're going after. Make sure you get the author's words. Often on these paradox or discrepancy questions, they'll use those two words somewhat interchangeably. it's really easy to kind of get distracted by something. So for example, like that first sentence kind of sounds like a conclusion. A report that many apples contain a cancer-causing preservative called alar apparently had little effect on consumers. And you can kind of start heading down all sorts of roads with it. But think about what the question's going after. We're trying to find the discrepancy. Your job here is to think structurally and go, what exactly is that discrepancy? We've got thing one, but thing two. And those two things have to be apparently contradictory. Two things that don't seem likely to both be true. And then we'll find the thing that resolves it. So this is where investing an extra 15 seconds, 30 seconds, whatever you need to be totally clear about which parts of this constitute that apparent discrepancy. Okay, so what is it here that seems to contradict? I would argue it's the second and third sentences. So thing one, a few consumers said that they were going to change their habits. So a few consumers planned to change their apple buying habits. As a result of the report. But guess what happened? Sales of apples in grocery stores, so where consumers often shop, fell sharply. In March, a month after the report was issued. Okay, something I want to highlight here. So I realize I'm a bit of a broken record on these short passages on the GRE. I keep saying, hey, their words are yours, their words are yours. A couple of really nice things in here. And when I see students struggle with this particular question, sometimes it's because they're missing those little modifiers, those little details that are going to help you understand the strength or scope or magnitude. So we're not saying that none of the consumers plan to change their apple buying habits. And sometimes students get a little thrown off by that and say, wow, we're not saying that none of them are going to change their habits. Some of them are responding and saying, oh, apples might be cancerous, I'm not going to buy these anymore. But notice the phrasing here, the sales of apples fell sharply. So however you want to interpret the word few, not very many consumers, not none either. But despite the fact that only a small handful said they're going to change their buying habits, we had a sharp drop off in sales at grocery stores. So that's the kind of thing you're looking for, wanting to make sure that you're not dropping those modifiers. One of the most common diseases we see on these short passages on the GRE, you miss one of those little modifiers, it can cause you trouble. A lot harder to make sense of the discrepancy without that. Okay, with that, we're looking for something that helps explain this. So why is it that most consumers are saying, yeah, no big deal, don't care about the cancer, it's all good, I love apples, I'm going to eat them anyway, not going to change my habits. But then for some reason, they're not buying them. A month later, sales fall through the floor. Why is that? Okay, so A, in March, many grocers removed apples from their shelves in order to demonstrate concern about their customers' health. Very, very sweet of them. Now, would this explain that discrepancy? Would it explain how these two things can coexist? Well, sure, the consumers are like, dude, I don't care. Cancer, no big deal. Apples are delicious. But if there's no apples on the shelves, that might explain why overall sales at grocery stores fell sharply. And again, be conservative on your first pass. You don't want to fall in love with something. Maybe you think that this reasoning isn't super strong. Maybe you're having a hard time making sense of A. If you don't have a good reason to eliminate it, don't. In this case, I think it's pretty good. I think this does a nice job of explaining why consumers say they're not going to change their habits, but then sales go down. It's because there's just no apples on the shelf. I'm going to hang on to A. But as always, be conservative. If you're a little confused on A, you're having a hard time understanding it, just keep it in. You can always cycle back through and deal with the last couple that you have left. What about B? Because of a growing number of food safety warnings, consumers in March were indifferent to such warnings, meaning there were so many of these warnings, consumers didn't care. Well, that would explain this, right? That would help explain why this is happening. Does it help explain the discrepancy? Well, not at all, because the discrepancy is, despite the fact consumers said they didn't care really, for some reason, sales fell apart. Why is that? Well, if there's a ton of food safety warnings and consumers are indifferent to them, that wouldn't help us understand why the sales fell sharply. So B is out. C, the report was delivered on television and also appeared in newspapers. I'm not sure why we care about that. Does it help us understand why consumers said, no big deal, I'm cool. I'm not going to change my habits. But then apparently they did change their habits. It doesn't do anything to help us with that. It just says, here's where they found out about it. I guess the implication was that the news was widespread, but that doesn't really help us understand why nobody or very, very few customers or consumers said that they would change their behavior, but tons of them did. C is out. What about D? The report did not mention that any other fruit contains LR, even though it is used on other fruit. Again, our scope here entirely about apples. So regardless of what's happening with other fruit that might have this same preservative that causes cancer, it's not going to help us. Whatever's happening with other fruit is going to have nothing to do with whether we can resolve this discrepancy that consumers said they weren't going to change their behavior, but they did. So D is totally irrelevant. Fairly easy one to get rid of. And what about E? Public health officials did not believe that it posed a health threat because only tiny traces of the chemical were present in the apples. Okay, well, that might help explain, very similar to B here, might help us explain why few consumers were worried about it. Public health officials didn't see it as that big of a threat. But then why is it that sales fell? E doesn't help us with that one bit. So E is out, and we're left with A. Okay, we're going to give you one more inference question. I'm going to challenge you with it a little bit. This is probably harder than I'd say 90% of GRE questions. Before we get there, if you're enjoying this video, please hit the like button. Please subscribe. Please spread the word. We're just getting going with our GRE channel after 20-something years of teaching GRE here at GMAT Ninja. So appreciate the support. If there's more you'd like to see, you want to see us do more examples, please weigh in the comments, and we'll do our best to produce videos that'll help you. Okay, last one here. Again, not trying to melt your face off with super hard things generally in this video. I think this one is fairly representative of the difficulty you're likely to see, even if you're a high scorer on GRE Verbal. This last one I'm going to challenge you a little bit. Straight inference question. Not so much on the structure. We're just saying, hey, which of the following is most likely to be true, basically based on it. But it's really about that precision of reading. I think it's a good bit tougher for most of you than these first three that we did. So last one, enjoy the challenge. As always, hit the pause button if you need a little more time. Okay, the reason why I wanted to finish up with this video, or with this question in this video, two reasons really. One is that I do see issues with inference questions, talked about them in the other GRE reading comp videos already, but want to kind of isolate it with the short ones for those of you who have trouble with it. And where I'm going with that is that it's really, really, really easy to overthink the idea of inferences. Textbook definition is something like it's something that's not directly stated, and you can drive yourself nuts thinking that way. When you see an inference question, I just want you to think, okay, which one of these is the most true based on the passage? That's it. Don't worry about whether it's directly stated, indirectly stated, something you really have to work to infer, or something that's kind of obvious. Don't worry about any of that. Find the one of the 5 answer choices that is the most true. Find the 4 that are not so true. And there you go. Don't overthink the word inference, number 1. Thing number 2, I really just wanted to challenge some of you guys. If your goal is a 160 plus on verbal on the GRE, it's a really good question. You should still make you stretch a little bit for a lot of you. We see a lot of super high scorers who come in, typical or MBA applicants, for example, they're shooting for a 160 plus on verbal. And I don't know, 30, 40, 50% of them miss this question when they first see it. So fairly tough one by the standards of the GRE. So I want to give you a workout. If you're here at the end of this video, thank you for sticking around and give you a little bit of a challenge. Okay. I didn't want to bore you by writing all this down as we go, but kind of the heart of this passage and where brains start to swim around a little bit as they read this is it kind of bounces back and forth. We got French, we got English, and we're kind of comparing the two, but we're also sort of going back and forth between French language and French literature and English language and English literature. And it can be really annoying to keep all of that straight in your head. Again, I'm not arguing that you need to write this much down as you take the GRE. That might be useful for you. It might not be. It just makes it a little easier to talk about it in a video form. Again, how many notes you take on the GRE, it's really dependent on how your brain works. If you're really kinesthetic, writing things down helps you think better, helps you engage, helps you understand the passage better. By all means, go for it. For the rest of you, I just want to make sure that you're investing enough in the passage to go, okay, I understand what's happening here. I understand the connections. When you get an inference question like this, you're not looking for a conclusion necessarily. There's very unlikely to be one. Don't hallucinate conclusions. There's no discrepancy or paradox where we can say thing one, but thing two. The previous 3 questions we did in this video, very structured, very nice sort of concrete ways to approach those 3. Here it's an inference. We're just saying, do you understand what's going on in the passage? Can you make some connections? Invest enough to make sure you're clear about what's happening. And then you move on. Really, all I've done on the board here is just separate out what are we saying about English? What are we saying about language versus literature? And then same thing for French. What are we saying about language versus literature? English, what do we know? We know that the literature reflects the rich and diverse vocabulary of the English language. So the literature itself is presumably rich and diverse as well. But what do we know about the language? Well, that rich and diverse vocabulary results from the dual influence of Anglo-Saxon and French. Okay, so 2 different languages influence the development of English. So you have this rich and diverse vocabulary, and that's reflected in the literature. But again, useful to separate out. Here's what we're saying about literature. Here's what we're saying about language. Same idea with the French here. What do we know about French? The literature's hallmark is simplicity and clarity. What do we know about the language? Analogous here. So it is a direct descendant of just Latin, few traces of the Celtic that was spoken by the pre-Roman inhabitants. So simple evolution of the language, direct descendant of a single previous language, and the literature, the hallmark is simplicity and clarity. Okay, good enough. Where the answer choice is going? Well, when you see an inference question, it could be that we're going to infer something that just picks on one little tiny piece of this. Could be that it's something that's a conclusion drawn from all of this. It might be the case that we end up ignoring most of this. That's totally fine. Your job here is just to say which of these 5, which 4 of these are not true, which one is true. That's it. Don't overthink inferences. All right, let's start going through these. A, the origin of English played a role in shaping English literature. And I get a lot of people eliminating this right off the bat because it's kind of boring. It doesn't seem to reflect all this. It doesn't say anything about French. And so we read all this crap about French, and now this is just, oh, the origin of English played a role in shaping English literature. Don't overthink it. Is this true? Sure. The evolution of the language comes from 2 different influences, 2 different languages. That's reflected in the rich and diverse vocabulary. Is reflected in the literature. So sure, the origin of English played a role in shaping English literature. It's a really uninteresting thing to say. We just read this nice long paragraph. It's an unremarkable statement. Doesn't matter. Is it true? Sure, seems pretty true to me. I'm going to keep it in. Emotionally, as you see this, what I hear a lot of students say is that they're hoping for something more interesting in the other answer choices. Maybe we'll get it, but that doesn't matter if it's interesting or rich or reflects the whole passage or not. The question is it true? Sure. What about B? The vocabulary of the Anglo-Saxon language was richer than that of French. Can't infer this at all. We don't know anything about the vocabulary of Anglo-Saxon. All we know is that Anglo-Saxon and French together influenced English. We don't know anything about the vocabulary of Anglo-Saxon itself. B is out. What about C? The vocabulary of English is larger than the vocabulary of French. Well, we don't necessarily know that. What do we know? We know that English has a rich and diverse vocabulary. What do we know about the French vocabulary? Nothing. Nothing at all. We know that French is a direct descendant of Latin, but we don't know whether it's larger. We don't know how many words there are in French, or for that matter, Latin. So we can't actually infer that the vocabulary of English is larger. We know that it's rich and diverse. We don't know whether the vocabulary is larger or smaller or equivalent to French. Subtle, but C is out. D, simple and clear literature cannot be written in a language with rich and diverse vocabulary. Nobody's saying that. So there's nothing here that supports an absolute statement that says that you can't write simple, clear literature in a language with rich and diverse vocabulary. Kind of doesn't pass the common sense test either. So the argument here would be that since English is rich and diverse, we can't write simple and clear literature in English. Certainly not supported by the passage. For what it's worth, also not common sense. D is out. What about E? English literature and French literature have had little influence on one another. We don't know that at all. We know that the languages, the evolution of these two languages, influence the development of literature, or at least mirrored it in some way in each of those languages. So language influenced the literature in French, language influenced the literature in English in some way, of course. But we don't know anything about how the literatures of French and English influenced each other. Now, we know that the French language influenced the English language. We don't know anything about whether the literatures influenced each other. And for that reason, E is out. And we're left with boring A. The origin of English played a role in shaping English literature. Boring, unremarkable. There's an instinct to go, not interesting enough to keep it. But it is certainly supported by the passage. None of the other four are. Okay, good challenge question. If you struggled on it, please, no shame at all. Good, tough one. We've seen people that get absolutely ludicrously high scores, GRE, for that matter, LSAT, GMAT, who've struggled on this question. So you're not alone if you got not tricked, but if you struggle a little bit, especially with A. No shame in it at all. All right. If you enjoyed this, again, please like and subscribe. If there's something else you'd like to see us cover in these videos, please let us know in the comments. Happy to oblige if enough folks are interested in something. And quick last piece of advice, if you're one of the badasses, pardon my language, that has lasted this far in the video, odds are good that you're somebody that would enjoy more practice. And again, very, very limited number of these short format GRE reading comp questions in the GRE official guides. Unfortunately, they just don't give us a lot of questions, those GRE official guides. So if you need extras, go get yourself a GMAT official guide, a GMAT verbal guide, as long as it's official. Go pick up an LSAT book and do what's called critical reasoning on the GMAT or logical reasoning on the LSAT. You see question types that don't quite map on, so you're free. If you want to just stick to these 4 question types, strength and weaken, assumption, discrepancy, paradox, and inference. If you just want to cherry pick for those, that's fantastic. If you just like the general practice of reading passages of this length, and you want to do the whole array of questions, critical reasoning for the GMAT, logical reasoning for the LSAT, knock yourself out. It can only help you. Again, these are a fairly small chunk of the test, but if you feel like you'd like to really master those, GMAT and LSAT are good ways to do it. All right, with that, thank you everybody for watching, and we'll see you next time.